And so if Pope Pius XII, if Eugenio Pacelli in Summi Pontificatus tells us that there are races, there are nations and peoples, so these are distinct things and they all exist. And if these groups have distinct characters, what are we left with? Most of what we're interested in here is still undefined. So in order to shine some clarity on what the issues are, we're going to have to go back 100 years in time to 1842. And we're going to look at a book by a Protestant. His name was Charles Colcock Jones. He was a Georgian planter, slave owner, Protestant, as I said. And he wrote a book called The Religious Instruction of Negroes, because he believed that Africans, black people, were or are human beings. And the class of entities that are human beings have a special relationship with their God. And therefore, even if Africans are very different than Europeans, Africans still have a relationship with their God. That means that they need religious development. They need Christianity. They need true religion. And they have to develop this up to a point at which they can be saved and live the kind of life that God and Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit want them to live. So he wrote this book. He wrote it because he saw that the ethical, moral, and religious condition of blacks in America in the 1840s was very poor. He devotes a lot of time to this in his book. And this is his reason for writing it. He wants to help these people. Now, this was a smart man and an honest man. That's pretty rare, right? So what he's doing in his book, part of it is he's negotiating between two positions that we could very, very easily identify today. And so we're going to start reading here on page 102 and 103, and then we're going to talk about the two positions that he brings out here and what the how to apply that to the problem that we're dealing with, and just to sort of delineate the problem so that we can go further. I'm going to pause this and I'll be right back. Okay, starting from the bottom of page 102, the top of this slide here, that the people of the United States indulge prejudices in respect to the Negroes, both in favor of and adverse to them, as a distinct variety of the human family and as a subordinate class in society, is a fact not to be disguised. On the one hand, their ignorance, vulgarity, idleness, improvidence, irreligion, and vice, this is the first prejudice, are to be ascribed altogether to their position and circumstances. So we have some evidence, okay, and that's these bad traits that he lists: ignorance, vulgarity, idleness, improvidence, irreligion, and vice. That's the evidence. This is not disputable at this time in 1842. What's the explanation? Number one, altogether to their position and circumstances. Let these be changed, their position and circumstances, for the better, and the African will immediately equal, if not greatly excel, the rest of the human family in majesty of intellect, elegance of manners, purity of morals, and ardor of piety. Yea, they will become the very beau ideal of character and the admiration of the world. Now, this text here I've got crossed out because it's just a duplicate. They messed up when they were printing this book back in the 1840s. So we'll pick up down here with the second prejudice. On the other hand, the race, Negroes, has been from time immemorial just what it is and just what it must continue to be. It occupies the position designed for it in nature and providence, and no changes and no efforts can ever, on the whole, alter it for the better. So now we have two poles, one in which everything is mutable, and the other in which everything is fixed. Okay? Prejudices also lie all along between these extreme oscillations of opinion. Happy is that mind which, under gales of excitement and conflicting with waves of agitation, preserves its balance, and, keeping its eye upon the truth, steadily advances towards it. It may be likened to the well-adjusted compass, which noiselessly preserves its equilibrium and faithfully points to the star, although the mountain waves roar and the ship is driven with the fierce winds and tossed. Okay, so I think that for 1842, this is fairly profound. He has identified these two seemingly psychological traits in human character, things of the left and of the right. On the left, in this case, you have, well, let's move to the next slide. See if I can shrink this down. Should have already done this. Okay, so on the left, you've got this idea essentially of blank slateism, and this is where E. Michael Jones is. He occupies this thing, which is a leftist, anti-hierarchical position. It's blank slateism and the idea that race is myth. You know, it's all just physical, accidental characteristics, and that pretty much everything can change. And so we could actually get Wakanda in Africa with enough work. We could get that. Now on the other side, okay, all the way over to the far right over here, you have racialism, human biodiversity, and materialist determinism, basically. The idea that, you know, human beings probably don't have any agency or free will, and everyone is merely acting out the genetic code that they're born with, and nothing can change anything. And then you've got all of these potential spots here in the middle where probably you and I are, but what I'm using this reading to show you is that these are essentially two psychological categories, and it seems to me like E. Michael Jones is on the far left here. And this is why he holds these, you know, essentially liberal, progressive opinions. This is why his ideas converge with the liberal left on this issue. He believes the exact same thing that they do. And as we move forward with this, we will, I will show you some clips. We'll listen to some clips of him talking where he says this. So we know that I'm not reading too much into it. He's basically said this himself. Okay, before we put this book aside, we're going to read a little bit more here. That part of the reason why I think this book is so interesting and why I like this guy, Charles Colcock Jones, so much is that not only does he show us the problem of having these two different tendencies, okay, he also gives us a little bit of a guidance here on this too, okay. Page 178 and 179, the proposition, he's dealing with this idea that he's heard people say that blacks are incapable of receiving religious instruction except to a very limited extent. And that's because presumably their intellectual capacity or their capacity for reason is so far below that of Europeans that trying to give them religious instruction is just not worth your time because they can't understand it. Okay? He disagrees with this. I'm not going to read all of this here. We're going to start down here with this underlined text in red. It is customary with many to entertain low opinions of the intellectual capacity of the Negroes. Whether this be right or wrong, we leave every man to judge for himself after a due investigation of the subject, and to judge likewise whether their mental weakness is to be attributed to the circumstances of their condition or to any difference as made by the author of their existence between them and other men. So this is the same debate that we're still having today when you look at the test scores of black kids and white kids in America. There are people who say, okay, maybe these black kids aren't performing at the same level, but it's due to their circumstances. So there's a there's all this different, there's these different gradations of these arguments where you'll say, no, there's no mental difference whatsoever between these kids. It's totally institutional racism. Then there's a step closer to the right side here with the HBD stuff where they say, okay, there is a difference, but it's totally due to their circumstances at this time, which has degraded them in terms of their physical capacity to cognate. Okay, to use their cognition. All right. Let me read this again because I got off track. Any difference between Negroes and other men as made by the author of their existence. So could God have possibly made them this way? If God has made such a difference, it cannot be proved to be any impeachment, either of his wisdom, goodness, or justice. This is the key part. Such a difference exists between individuals without any such impeachment, and may exist in like manner between the races of mankind. Now, my friend sent me a whole bunch of information from the Stonyhurst Philosophical Series, which is a late 19th century and early 20th century books of philosophy and Catholic moral teaching, Catholic moral philosophy basically. It includes psychology, ethics, all these related issues, and it was written by Jesuits in the 1890s, 1910s, and 20s. And it's supposed to be very highly reputed. Now, I looked through all of these books, scanned for keywords, trying to find where these guys in these books about psychology and moral teaching are talking about differences between individuals. And this is key. For them, it's all about agency. It's all about life experience. They essentially reject or move past the idea that people are born with different capabilities. And to the extent that it's possible, they refer only to the characteristics of man as man rather than between two men. Okay? And it's pretty easy to see why guys like Galton, Spearman, all these people, Egon, oh God, give me just a second. Sorry, I said Spearman. I'm getting my statisticians confused. I was trying to say Carl Pearson and Egon Pearson. So why would men like Galton, the two Pearsons, people like Fisher, why would all of these guys care so much about genius? Why would genius interest these guys? Why would they be so interested in looking for this and spend so much time on this? It's because whatever can create a genius is also what refers to the intellectual capacity itself. So by looking at geniuses, you can isolate the intellectual capacity and know its strength. Now, what these Catholic moral philosophers seem to do, by comparison, as I said, is that they sort of look past the high-performing individuals, because that would potentially refer to this, what if people were actually born with a greater or lesser capacity to reason, and therefore not everyone has the same moral playing field? You might be more likely to sin than I. Well, that's not really fair. Why would God put us in that position? And there's a lot of ways out of that, but there's a lot of ways to get past this problem philosophically, but for some reason they just seem to completely ignore it. Okay, what are we going to do now? Let me pull up that Stonyhurst stuff that I'm talking about, and then we'll look at that. So again, the issue that we're trying to figure out now, based on what we learned from Charles Colcock Jones, is where do the individual differences, the differences between people, where does that come from? And in order to figure that out from this Catholic perspective that I know E. Michael Jones is coming from, I looked at the Stonyhurst Philosophical Series, looked through 3 or 4 of their books, and I found the closest answer I could find was in Michael Mayer's book, Psychology, Empirical, and Rational. There's a bunch of different editions of this on archive.org. I'm using, I think, the 9th edition from either 1914 or 1919. And so, looking through most of these books, they really want to talk about the ideal divisions of the human mind, the human soul, the human spirit, all these different components, all the different, either the tripartite or the pentapartite divisions of the inner capacity of the human individual, the non-physical stuff, the spiritual, mental, and intellectual stuff. So they don't talk about differences between you and I, you and this other fellow, these two women over here. They don't talk about that. They talk about what do all humans have in common. Okay, and that's very interesting because that's a Catholic, right? Literally, that's a Catholic thing. You're talking about what do all humans share? All functional humans, what are their capacities? What do they share? So they don't talk about differences between two people because to them, I guess it just doesn't matter. It's not interesting. Alternatively, it might be dangerous because it might lead you into having some discussions that are, dangerous, right? So the closest thing that I could find is these pages on, it's basically 390 to 393 from Michael Mayer's book, Psychology, Empirical and Rational. Here on 392, he talks about types of character. So if a man is wont to make his decisions on sound reason, we have the highest type of strong character. There are some men who quickly form judgments on transient impulses or slight grounds, but just as readily change or reverse their choice. So earlier he talks about how the most important thing in the development of the moral sense are the early experiences of the individual. So what was your childhood like? What was your family situation like? And according to him, that explains more than anything else. But then there's something left over. There's something that it doesn't explain. Let me see if I can back this up one page. Okay, so down here for character, the total collection of a man's acquired moral habits, grafted into his natural temperament, make up his character. Character is thus partly inherited, partly formed by experience. So this is good. He's recognizing this, I think, that there is given to each by nature a certain original disposition, a certain fund of qualities, both intellectual and moral, varying in different individuals, is evident from the differences which in later life mark the personality of members of the same family and of individuals reared under very similar circumstances. So he's saying we know it can't all be environment because we'll see two siblings, or twins, for instance, who were raised identically and then behaved differently later on. Okay, this is sort of an inverse of the twin studies later, who are sort of trying to prove the opposite thing. But that's it's good at least that he's recognizing this. So now we'll move over here to temperaments on 393. Man's character then is partly inherited, partly acquired, due, as recent writers say, in part to nature and in part to nurture. The original element, insofar as it is determined by his bodily constitution, was called his temperament by the ancients. And then he goes on to describe this stuff, choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic, and melancholy, these different character traits. So this is about the extent of it that I can find. This is the extent of the Catholic teaching on these innate differences between individuals. And what they choose to focus on rather are what's the impact of your own personal moral agency? So how did you decide to make choices that affected your development? And then two, what were your environmental characteristics? And so if these are the two primary things, then you can pretty much fix all of it, because you can go and you can improve the situation of the individuals. If there's some people living in slums in Africa or Central America, and that's leading them to be violent and do prostitution and things like this and sell drugs, you can go clean up those slums. And once you clean up those slums, a lot of those problems will disappear. What's left over? It has to be the moral failings of the individual. So then you can minister to them personally. right? And you can use the gospel in your religious teachings to lift them up. So according to this position, you can pretty much fix everything. Later on, we're going to get into the next problem with this, which is what does it mean to fix something? What does it mean for you, a European Christian, a Jesuit, to go to South America and make them start behaving like Europeans? Okay, what's the link between the gospel message of Jesus Christ and European civilization? Are these the same thing? Is there only one kind of civilization? Did it come from Christ or did it come from the Greco-Roman world? So those are additional complicating factors that we'll get into later. But right now, this is merely to say that we know we have differences between individuals. And Charles Colcock Jones showed us that since that's okay with God, what is the problem with having differences between races? If it's not unjust, unfair, and wrong for God to create differences between individuals, why would it be wrong to create differences between races? Okay? We'll be back again. Thank you.